There's a common misunderstanding, I think, in the broader industry that the concept of deception and deception as a class of capabilities is something that is a later stage in the maturation journey area to invest in, when in reality and in practice, the value of implementing deception capabilities earlier in the traditional security capability or maturation lifecycle is incredibly compelling, effective, and it can be very, very efficient.
I'm Andy, so I'm the CEO, co-founder of Tracebit. Very excited to be joined here by Josh to talk about security canaries, deception, and the like. It's a very quick intro to Tracebit. That's kind of what we do. We're focused on bringing security canaries to the masses with a platform that we're building. And yeah, Josh, I'll hand over to you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks. Yeah. So I'm Josh Yavor. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Credible Security. We're a cybersecurity advisory firm, and so we work with early stage startups through upper mid-market, lower enterprise, and we partner with founders and IT and security practitioners to help people achieve effective, pragmatic, and efficient solutions.
Anything you'd like to sort of mention about like how your affiliation with Tracebit or anything like that?
Yeah, of course. So I happen to know the founders, yourself included, having worked together at Tessian, and I'm a proud early investor in the company as well. And so it's been fantastic to be, not just on the sidelines for the journey, but actually having the ability to be part of that journey as well.
Yeah, I mean, let's jump into it. So would love to hear. I mean, always interested to hear some stories and tales about like deception, canaries, etc. Maybe that's a good place to start. Like maybe where your first experiences with canaries and like how that experience was could be a good place to begin.
And I was thinking about my history with canaries and deception as a concept. I had the kind of shocking realization that it's been part of my, life for the better part of a decade. Actually, more than a decade, if you count just like personal experimentation when I was like, before I formally got into the industry. But I would say it's the journey has evolved from things like running my first lamp stack server in like a early VPS style like web hosting environments, and realizing that I could get interesting information by monitoring different port configurations with different services, and then just figure out what I could learn from like looking at log data and traffic, to then inform myself around, hey, is this Drupal website that I'm standing up for myself or for somebody else, like getting any attention? By having a extra SSH port open or something that looks like telnet but isn't, just early experimentation like that, especially when I was like in undergrad and then like going through the rest of my formal education. And then that really evolved as I got into security practitioner roles in a variety of like companies and environments. I was lucky enough to have a very broad range of different experiences, ranging from extremely heavy investment in bare metal and early virtualization technologies to make a almost 100% accurate copy of a corporate environment for detonating malware in, to then instrument and figure out, cool, what are these attackers actually trying to do, all the way to things like protecting our intellectual property by hiding little URLs or other files and gems in critical information that was being shared with third parties, so that we'd have some signal if those were ever accessed outside of a clean room environment, for example, and everywhere in between, including things like instrumenting using canaries in high risk laptop situations for engineers who have access to critical customer data, or canary deployments or honeypots in really sensitive network environments, both on-prem and also in public cloud. So it's been a very broad and exciting journey so far.
I'd love to jump into some of those and unpick them. Like
Yeah.
maybe some of the early ones. It'd be great to hear some of the stories you've got.
What was really eye-opening to me early on, and this is starting with that, like really, I was lucky enough to work with a company that had already recognized the value and also the necessity of investing in deception capabilities to then figure out what more advanced attackers were attempting to do. So this was a while back. And it was in the very early days of commercially available sandbox environments for software analysis. And so the organization that I was part of had an approach where we wanted to know more about the malware attacks that we were already catching, and the only way to actually figure out what the attackers were going to do after successful execution of the malware payload was to allow it to detonate somewhere. And therein lies the problem, right? So you need to figure out a way to do that safely. And while this was still the early days of sandbox environments, there was still early adversarial detection of, am I in a sandbox? And so all of the open source or the very early commercial sandbox options were being caught and by the malware that we were trying to detonate, and therefore we were not able to actually fully see what was going to go on. And so it was a really fascinating journey through partnering with some of the infrastructure and security teams that actually had implemented bare metal and virtualized environments that actually rather faithfully replicated a more traditional, Windows Active Directory on-prem environment, including things like fake data and systems and user accounts and things like that. And it was a fascinating experience to be able to say, okay, we can actually take some of the malware payloads, detonate those in virtualized or in some cases bare metal systems, whether a server or a laptop or a desktop or so on, and then be able to see what happened. And so I learned a lot in terms of the full range of what Canary and Deception and Honeypot technologies can really offer there, because in that case we were using primarily like network and Honeypot centric instrumentation, but then there was also a time and place there for file level canaries as well. And so it was really interesting to see what otherwise would have been completely missed had we not been able to actually have that environment. Unfortunately, of course, very high cost, very high complexity, all relatively speaking. And so while that was a really exciting opportunity and experience, and it kind of painted the picture of the art of the possible for me, there was also the realization that this is absolutely not for everyone. And so I think that's why I get really excited about the opportunities these days to say, great, how do we get the most efficient and effective bits and pieces of those same outcomes through modern technology that allows those same outcomes to be accessible to just about every company on earth without needing that type of like expertise or really heavy investment in teams as well as in infrastructure costs.
So would you say like threat intelligence was the value from that exercise? Like what would you say was the value you got from that?
Yeah, I would say generally the higher level was there are two higher order value propositions there. Threat intelligence is one, and again, I think that's the value of actual threat intelligence really will vary based off of what an organization is set up to be able to utilize. There are a lot of organizations where knowing all the juicy details from a threat intel perspective may not actually have a functional like mapping internally for like, oh, okay, we have a team who understands what that means and what to do with that information. So for us, we had one of those teams. It was fantastic. It was a very data rich set of bits and pieces of visibility that actually had like actionable results on our end because we were able to answer questions around specific malware behaviors and attacker techniques that were being applied to attacks against us. But the other category is really validation or invalidation of assumptions around our ability to defend and detect. And so it overlaps a bit, of course, with like what you would call threat intelligence data. But really, the value for I think most, if not all, organizations for that type of setup and value is knowing based off of like what the attackers are actually like demonstrably doing, whether or not your planned defenses, both like your proactive defenses for preventing or containing that type of malicious behavior, and then also your ability to detect and respond to any instances of those behaviors. That's a really critical value stream for that type of instrumentation. You're able to do things like say, we see attackers doing this, we feel with 80, 90, plus percent confidence that our existing controls map successfully to the preventative side there. Or perhaps you find that while you are like solid on most of the prevention, in the event that there is a bypass to some of those prevention techniques, you may find out that your detection capabilities are actually lacking, and therefore response may not be feasible in a reasonable amount of time to address any attack. So I'd say it's really those two categories of, yes, threat intelligence, but really as perhaps a subset of like some of the threat intelligence coming out of deception techniques like using canaries and honeypots. It's answering those questions of how well do how well are our defenses configured, what gaps may we have in our defenses, and then again critically, how capable are we on the detection and response side for if and when these types of actions actually happen in our environments.
So that's helping you to like prioritize other work and make better decisions to improve the security and level up the security.
Exactly. And I would say too that like, it's one thing to read annual reporting from all the big names in the industry around attacker trends and what exploit techniques are working and are more popular or less popular. And it's another thing to actually have tooling in your environment that allows you to actually have real life signals of what's being attempted, because there's always going to be a gap between global or even industry specific trends and every individual organization. And so I think that, both are useful, but you can actually have a much better experience consuming broader threat intelligence reports around, annual trends in classes of attacks and different threat actors that are emerging or declining. And, your actual lived experience that you're able to actually get better information out of by actually having good deception technology in place.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've been in that situation. I certainly have, of seeing behaviors or techniques that you haven't read about anywhere, and that doesn't mean they're not happening. Like they're still happening. And yeah, I completely agree. Having that specific example.
Yes, it helps you get more specific, right? And I think like the best experience there is you may read in a report that like this new there's a higher spike in certain types of exploitation around network devices or commonly used software, perhaps that are ubiquitous in in modern software environments. It's one thing to know again categorically that certain attacks or trends are on the rise. It's another thing to say, oh, okay, we can actually, through the use of canaries or honeypots, put in representative systems within our environment that allow us to know not only when we see that type of attack come up, but also the specifics of what is this threat actor or these threat actors, if you're seeing multiple, actually doing under that broader category. And that'll help you get a better idea of things like exploit mitigation techniques that you can implement, specific to your environment, rather than otherwise needing to mostly guess in terms of the appropriate mitigations that you could otherwise put in place without those signals from a canary or a honeypot solution.
And then, so you gave us an example there of quite a large, complex, involved deception solution. Are there any kind of more like lower maturity, earlier stage experiences you've had?
One of the myths that I try to help dispel a little bit, because you mentioned like maturity and that is that like there's a common misunderstanding I think in the broader industry, especially within practitioners too, that the concept of deception and deception as a class of capabilities is something that is a later stage in the maturation journey area to invest in, when in reality and in practice, I have found that like the value of implementing earlier deception capabilities earlier in the traditional security capability or maturation lifecycle is incredibly compelling, effective, and it can be very, very efficient. Where I get really excited about that, based off of some of the experiences I've had, is dirt cheap, very simple to implement, and extremely high like value signals, like taking a high risk population of employees. In one of the cases that I mentioned at the beginning, it was it was implementing a Canary token strategy that would allow us to know if a threat actor had compromised one of our high risk workforce computing assets, so a laptop or a desktop. And so what we did was we had a number of files that were generated for each of these employees' devices. And they were uniquely generated to each device. And so we had at any given time, in these days, this is an organization that had probably like 60 to 80 engineers where we were targeting protection and coverage for canaries of their laptops. And so we had, a number of uniquely generated files that were mapped to each one of those employees' systems. And on the back end, we just had a very simple, notification setup where if one of these files was opened up and there was the call back to the service that we were using, and that notification came in, we immediately knew, which laptop and for which user this call came from, and where that file was originally stored. And that allowed us to actually then initiate a very confidently urgent investigation to then figure out, what had actually happened. And in my time, we had one or two of these signals go off, and thankfully, it was usually like a new joiner coming in and then like exploring their own new laptop that they got from the company, and they happened to stumble across what was admittedly a very interesting looking file, and then they would open it up. And so while those were interesting fire drills to go through, it was also really valuable for us because it was an occasional reminder that things actually worked the way that we had intended. But again, like dirt cheap, very, very easy. We made it part of the onboarding process on the IT side to work on actually generating those files, and then making sure that those were implemented and seeded rather on those systems. So really, really accessible. Any organization can do this. I think like if I had to like estimate like time and like overhead costs for us, it was a few minutes per new hire like laptop deployment, and probably like I don't know an hour or two in management overhead like out of my team for like for the course of a year for something like that. So very, very simple even years ago when this was.
Out of interest, you touched on something there, which was, you did this and you only saw, we call internally like benign positives, but, ultimately like the curious engineer detection or something like that. You may not have actually seen any genuine detections. A question we sometimes hear or an objection we sometimes hear is, if it doesn't go off, then it hasn't proven value. Which I always think is curious because no one would say that about an EDR, but I'd be interested to hear your perspective on that.
I think the comparison to EDR is a good one. And I think that like it's I have two thoughts here. One is that if that's a common objection, I think it's because it's coming from the wrong paradigm. I think aligning the paradigm with more appropriately, like with tooling like EDR technology, where yes, there are many other signals that you can look at to say, oh, the agents that I have for my laptops are deployed, they're checking in, this many hosts are online, things like that. You do have a continuous feedback cycle to prove that the EDR coverage is there, even if it's not firing off like high risk incidents or like host isolation events or anything like that. So I do think that is a more appropriate paradigm, as well as like a way to actually start thinking more appropriately around how do you know that your Canary or honeypot like coverage is still live and healthy, right? I think those are legitimate like data points and feedback loops to look at and and ask of the technology and tooling that you're using, right? How do you know in a world where these very rarely fire off, hopefully, how do you know that they are still correctly configured, appropriately deployed, healthy, checking in, and something hasn't broken? But again, very, very similar to the paradigm for EDR. So I think that's the first part. And I think the second part there too is that the absence of signal is actually a delightful change from industry norms, right? So if you look at another part of the industry, right? So you look at like security operations and how that's evolved over the course of the last couple of decades. we're still coming out of a world where the answer to security, largely for like a security event and data processing perspective, was take all of your security logs and anything else you can get your hands on, throw it into your very expensive sim, and then learn how to build detections and alerts on top of that. But based on the assumption that you have a copious amount of data, most of which is actually not useful in an alerting perspective. It may be useful from an investigatory perspective, but the totality of that volume of data, most of it is there to be available in the event of like a deeper investigation being necessary. Most of it, though, does not actually help in the identification and alerting for something bad that may be happening. And so I think that if you think about like signal to noise ratio, that's a better way to think about like the lack of the relative lack of frequency of notification events coming out of Canary and honeypot technologies. In a well configured situation, in my mind, the signal from a Canary or honeypot solution is extremely high signal, almost no noise, most likely, again, if it's well configured. And what that lets you do is have these relatively rare compared to the rest of the detection and response world signals where you can act with like near 100% confidence that whatever you're looking at based off of that signal is probably worth your time to go and chase and figure out what's going on. We often, in the traditional like SecOps coverage world, are stuck with this question of when do we actually wake somebody up in the middle of the night? At what confidence threshold and through what signals like does that actually clear the bar, so to speak, to say yes, somebody should get paged at 4 o'clock in the morning their time and they need to like get hands on keyboard in the next 10 minutes. Having a really high confidence signal from tools like canaries and honeypots just helps so much in saying, yeah, if this ever goes off, that is a page, not just this one person, page this entire team, perhaps, or the set of people who then need to actually start taking a look at this. Because, to your original question, this should never go off, and it never does go off. And if it ever does, then yes, that is a 4 alarm fire, so to speak.
You mentioned some other Canary experiences, some other honeypot experiences. Would love to hear the other stories.
Yeah, one of my favorites, just because it was fun to actually like sit down with my team and my stakeholders and think about how we were going to solve this problem. It was in a situation where we had to support another part of our company in sharing highly sensitive data with a third party. And this third party was you always establish contractual trust and consequences and things like that when you enter into these types of interactions. But there's always, to some extent, a leap of faith that needs to be made that the third party that you are sharing perhaps some of your crown jewels with will act in good faith, and that the security of their system configurations meets your needs and expectations. And so in this event, like the thing that we were trying to figure out was how could we know if something bad happened to our data after it leaves our control. And we did a lot on the preventative side up front. Ran this third party through the third party risk management ringer, asked all the due diligence questions you could imagine, but we were still left with this need to have an answer to how would we know if something went wrong. And we really struggled to find good answers until one of my team members actually had a very creative thought, which was, we are sharing a whole bunch of information for this business purpose, and that's all fine and good. Nobody said that we can't share extra information. And so what we thought of was, okay, what if we just included some additional files or bits of data? And in this case, it was URLs, IPs, as well as a few files that had no purpose whatsoever, in the broader context of the actual data that needed to be shared. we had to be very careful about making sure that this would not interrupt any of the actual like business processes that needed to happen. But because this data was going into like what's called a clean room environment, where it's supposed to be like sufficiently isolated and that data could like never like then reach the internet, that's really what we wanted to test. And so what we were able to do by including some of those extra bits and pieces that were actually like canaries that would call back, is we were able to like provide the assurance to ourselves and to our organization that in the event that the clean room was inappropriately configured, or somehow data had escaped the clean room and was being opened up elsewhere, that we would have a signal back to us that would immediately notify us that that data was then live on the or was uh, live on a network that had access to call out to the internet, in that case. And so it was one of the more creative uses that I've seen to date in terms of like using Canary technologies. And what I can say too is like one of the learning experiences I had from that is like, let people get creative, like give them this type of technology and then just let them learn how to use it. And they will often come up with very creative ways to give very high signal, high value coverage in ways that, you might be surprised by. I was certainly surprised by, the efficacy of what we could pull off there. And it also, as another positive side effect, it leads to some really cool conversations with your legal team as well. When you're trying to game out, okay, cool. How do we make sure that we're doing this in a way that like won't cause any harm, won't get anyone in trouble, won't break what we're trying to do. But then also you can plan on, hey, if we do get a signal back from this, what do you want to know? What can we tell you in terms of like what action we should consider taking in terms of reaching out to the third party? Are there any like bits and pieces of data that would be better for us to capture and be able to share where it would be contractually relevant to the agreement that we otherwise had around protection of the data and so on? So it's yeah, that was a very interesting and fun journey, and that one thankfully never went off.
And was that perceived out of interest as a win, like outside of security? Was like, were the legal team excited by that? The assurance they got from it was considered a success?
Fundamentally being able to say that like we had done anything, because like remember, this is like, I mean, still to this day what I just described is very uncommon, right? It's at least to my knowledge, I'm not aware, when I've told the story to friends and peers, I've only run into like one or two other folks who've done something like remotely similar. And so I think that like it's very unusual to even be able to say that like we were able to do anything that would provide some sort of awareness that would allow us to then take action in response, after we had taken a corpus of highly sensitive information and then shared it with a third party for them to then handle in in their own environment. I think that like what I learned out of that experience was, and then like the value that I saw in like how my team thought about solving the problem was they didn't accept the premise that like you can't do anything beyond the periphery of the actual activity that we were trying to support. And so I think, to their credit, by taking the initiative and thinking about like, okay, do we have the opportunity to do anything within the actual data set that we are sharing over? I think that's the thing that gets skipped over, just behaviorally, and because that's normal. There are so many situations in which there's like data exchange between parties, like today, right? Like there's like who knows how to even count that between any like modern organization and its third parties. But I think like the opportunity is to think about like what are the truly high risk ones, where it's really a one-off event, especially if there's ever like a clean room in particular type of situation being used. I mean, usually that's for like litigation. It's used for corporate development for like acquisitions and things like that. Also for investment cycles, and similar. So like there's a category or class of activities in terms of data sharing where I think that like this is something that more people should be thinking about in terms of like how do you potentially Again, you have to be safe here. But like, how do you potentially make it so that you have the ability to have a signal if something goes wrong there? So yeah, I think it's just a factor of those not actually being all that common, relatively speaking, and then a lack of historic practices of saying, oh, wait a second, we should actually think about how we can directly participate in the data sharing experience itself, rather than just doing a traditional like security evaluation of which clean room provider or technology are they using, what other technical controls may be in place in that environment. That's all really important, but I think that's usually where most organizations stop.
Is there anywhere else you've used canaries outside of the use cases we've discussed so far?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we've been talking so far about canaries being a what I would call like a leading edge detection capability, right? Where it's the thing that will tell you when something bad has likely happened, or at least unusual and unexpected. Um, but I think like the last use case I would share is one where that's already happened, and then canaries actually have a play. And I've actually done this directly myself, and my teams have done it in the past as well, where after we've identified that there's threat actor behavior in some communication platform, usually email, sometimes SMS, or these days in WhatsApp, or Signal, in terms of threat actors now using modern like end-to-end encrypted platforms to conduct social engineering attacks. When we found situations where we become aware of threat actor activity in communication channels, where we can interact with them, one of the things that we've done is actually use canaries, whether it's file based or like domain or URL or even online system based. We've actually been able to spin up like kind of like dynamically or just in time different canary capabilities to then use to actually communicate back with the threat actor to learn more about their attack techniques, or what their interests may actually be. And so most of the time, it gives you superficial bits of knowledge. So, for example, somebody reaching out and impersonating a third party that we otherwise would have trusted. They'd reached out to somebody in our sales team. The salesperson had actually reported the social engineering and like phishing attempt. We were able to look at this and say, okay, this one smells funny. It's more sophisticated than the run of the mill like phishing attacks. So let's actually figure out a way to like safely engage and like send a link to a Canary URL that would capture their IP address. It would capture information around like the system or host that they're coming from. And it would help us determine like if they are using like VPN technology or something like that, which infrastructure are they using. It just helps us build a better picture. And so while it's few and far between in terms of like the frequency of doing things like this, we were able to like regularly use canaries in a response to a to a threat actor who had like caught our attention, and that helped us figure out more about them as a threat actor, and then helped us more longitudinally identify patterns that we're seeing. So we're able to identify like specific campaigns through the common use of certain like VPN technologies or common fingerprints, like they all shared the same user agent string, or like language configuration, depending on like what their browser would tell us when they hit a website, and things like that. So that was really fun and enlightening. We did do some file based things as well to help get some information about like operating systems and things like that. You do have to be careful here, of course, and make sure that like your that you have a really solid and vetted plan for like how you will actually engage safely with a known adversary. And of course, there's potential like legal implications as well that you have to make sure that you cover off. But once you have like that done, it's not that hard. It becomes a very compelling way to learn more about attacker behavior without needing the full fledged virtualization infrastructure that I talked about in one of the earlier examples.
That's super interesting, and that it kind of just ties into that kind of lightweight, easy, quick win, almost like sending a URL, sending a file, and getting that additional intelligence that allows you to up your game and take some other actions. That sounds like that could be quite powerful.
Exactly. Yeah, and while it might not get you like a full sandbox like capability for going really deep on malware reversal and analysis, it covers off so much of what you would otherwise want to know. And so it's the complexity and the cost is minimal. Most of the work is really just on the process side, knowing what technology that you have available on the Canary side, and then figuring out where and how to introduce it into your normal like response workflows when you actually have the opportunity to say, hey, we're getting a whole bunch of CFO impersonation text messages that are being sent out to our employee base. How do we figure out if they're all related? How do we figure out what they might be trying to do, or similar? And that's where the opportunity really arises to use Canary technology for something like that in a very efficient manner.
Something we get excited about when we think about deception canaries is the kind of psychological impact on the attacker. I'm interested in your perception of that. Like, do you buy it? Are you bought into that, or like, what's your view?
I think it's actually changing these days. I think that like with so many more attacks becoming automated, um, even when you may have a very sophisticated individual or team of individuals who are highly capable, just hands on keyboard, so to speak, conducting an attack. Attackers, just like defenders, are subject to the laws of economics, right? And so attackers want to minimize the cost of their attacks. And even in the more sophisticated situations, they're going to be trying to identify force multipliers where they're using tooling and automation to drive their capabilities and reduce the cost ultimately of their hopefully on their end successful attack. And so I think like in obviously like AI is playing more and more role there. There's a question mark as to how that'll evolve over the coming years. But we know that the use of technology to automate attack behaviors is only going to increase. So I think as that has happened, I think that like the emotional impact has changed, if not diminished, a bit. In a world where things were mostly hands on keyboard, as a human being is thinking about every step of the attack that they're conducting, from doing some of the initial like intelligence and discovery to like actually getting like the first foothold on some system and thinking about pivoting and trying to get into different systems. That was a highly emotional state relative to letting tooling do all that work, because every step of the way you are a human making a decision, and there's an inherent level of excitement that comes with that, right? I'm saying this as somebody who like I got into security professionally, like on the penetration testing side, and so like whether it's red team operations or like doing security assessments of different like infrastructure, like I've been in that seat, right? There is a thrill that comes with getting to the next stage of your attack without getting caught. And so I do think that canaries introduce in like those still manual situations more of a thrill when you don't get caught by a canary, but also more fear up front, right? You actually have to proactively think about, okay, am I about to reach out over a network, scan a network, interact with like some service in a way that will actually tip off the attackers, because I think it's likely an RDP service or a web server or something like that. But in reality, it's actually a canary. And what I just did was I lost the game. I gave away my presence. Again, I think that like absent the direct engagement of a human in that decision making, a lot of that emotional impact is diminished. Of course, it means that like modern attackers now are thinking more and more about how to address this risk from an automation perspective as well, right? So can they learn how to fingerprint canary technology? Can they uh, do can they introduce additional techniques that may be more passive, right? That will allow them to identify and bypass different more likely canary locations, whether that's at the network level or in different like file or system deployments, and so on. So yeah, I think that emotions will always like be part of that. But I think that like hopefully hopefully if things go well and Canary technology continues to be more broadly adopted, the real emotion will just be one for frustration after the fact on the attacker part, right? Because whether it's like through a manual attack or through automation, hopefully if we get Canaries to continue to be like correctly deployed and we're broadly deployed and adopted, frustration is hopefully what those attackers will start to feel more often.
I think the point about automation taking some of the emotion out is a really good one. But yeah, completely agree that the goal is broad adoption of Canaries to create frustration.